Cityforum is delighted to host this podcast at the time of the publication of the long-awaited Oxford Handbook of Cybersecurity, to which a number of the panellists involved in our cyber programs are contributing. Our chief strategist, Paul Cornish, edited the handbook, and he guides the podcast discussion today. Sir David Omand, Chris Demchak, and Mike Steinmetz, three significant panellists from our work in cybersecurity, feature in a discussion that is both high-level and lucid. We're presenting this podcast as the opening discussion in our 2021 Resilience Programme, in which digital security will be a central feature. We're very grateful to the four of you for contributing to this opening event, and we think this discussion will have interest among our supporters all over the world. Paul, thank you.
Hello, my name is Paul Cornish. I'm the Chief Strategist of Cityforum and Visiting Professor at LSE Ideas at the London School of Economics. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to the latest in Cityforum's podcast series. And today's title is The Threat of Digital Disruption in a Digitised World. I'm going to hand over straight away to Sir David Omand, former UK Security and Intelligence Coordinator, former Director of GCHQ, now a Professor at King's College London. Over to you, Sir David.
Well, thank you, Paul. And the question I was asked to address is, do we understand the degree of our dependence on the internet and the World Wide Web? It's a foundational question, and I tried to highlight it in my foreword to Paul's Oxford Handbook of Cybersecurity. And my short answer is that it's clear that those who study the subject deeply, like Paul and Chris and Mike here today, do understand the dependence and all the associated risks that brings. But it's not yet the case, in my observation, that governments and private and public sector organisations really get it, despite all the recent advances such as setting up of national cybersecurity centres. Nor do we have international, and in some cases even national, agreement on what to do to improve our resilience to these dangers. But don't get me wrong here, it's not just that we're dependent on the internet and the web for commercial and financial transactions and on social media for the structure of everyday life, as we've experienced in coping with COVID-19. We're also wholly dependent on these technologies of digitisation of every form of information for our future economic growth and social development. And that applies, I think, both to the advanced economies of the G20 and in the global south. And any major loss of public confidence in the ability safely to use the internet and the web would, I think, be crippling to that future. As I'm fond of saying, we rushed in to seize the advantages of the technology over the last 30 years without paying proper heed to the vulnerabilities it would create for our societies. And our reliance has crept up on us little by little. For example, as we introduced internet-connected control systems, as we used GPS time signalling to stabilise power networks and so on. And our understanding of the consequent risks we've built up through this dependence hasn't really kept pace. And it's become, I think, divorced from the actual risky behaviours that we see companies and individuals exhibiting online. We do understand much more today than we all did. If I pick a date, October 1995, when the protocols of the internet were finally agreed by the US Federal Networking Council, defining the internet as the global information system, being linked by the address space based on the IP and the TCP/IP suite. At that time, I was director of GCHQ here in the UK, and I was starting a digital revolution, unknown to us. That was when the first Russian cyber attack on the United States, Moonlight Maze, was being put into operation. And since those early days, we've seen both the dramatic rise of our dependence on the internet and the web, and what I call the cesspit: crime, espionage, sabotage and subversion, perverting internet technology. And we've seen the rise in an increasing number of state actors deploying the many methods of digital deception to undermine democracy itself and to exacerbate tensions within our societies. We all know we've got over 3.5 billion users of the internet. Research from Cisco estimates there'll be over 27 billion network devices by the end of this year. And globally, that's about 3.5 network devices per person on the planet. 43% of those network devices will be mobile connected by next year. So we've got these extraordinary vulnerabilities. They seem to me to stem from innate human gullibility, a bit of laziness, a bit of corruption through insiders' threats. We've got the wide availability of digital personal information. We've got the potential for hostile access to infrastructure and control systems. We've got zero-day flaws that are still being found. And we've got as we saw recently, the ability of adversaries to inject malware via the supply chain, as we saw with SolarWinds. And in all the control system and Internet of Things vulnerabilities, these have the capacity to seriously interfere with our life, as we saw with the Russian hack that shut down the power companies serving Kiev. And increasingly over the last few years, I've noticed greater emphasis on hardware vulnerabilities. So memory chips have fundamental rowhammer flaws in DRAM, CPUs are full of side channels and transient execution problems, so there's information leakage across pretty much all security boundaries. And those sort of things like the chip kernel design flaws, those we're going to have to live with for as long as the technology is there, because they're hardwired. We can't replace them. And for the commercial sector, the potential of an adversary, a commercial competitor or a criminal, to destroy product and service reputation and market valuation is now pretty high up the risk register. And then finally, to conclude this litany of woe, the immersive nature of the internet itself. It creates an environment of illusion. A collective hallucination was the description William Gibson gave it when coining the concept of cyberspace. And we all know about the conspiratorial turn of mind that social media has encouraged. So we're not just technically vulnerable. And for individual businesses, some of this can represent existential threat. We saw that when Maersk, the world's biggest shipping company, was hit with the Russian NotPetya worm, pretending to be a ransomware attack, but actually a deliberately disruptive attack intended to hit the Ukrainian government's ability to operate. Maersk, I understand, had a shipping office in Odessa in Ukraine on the Black Sea. It used the Ukrainian tax software that was the vehicle. The updates were the vehicle for the Russian attack, and that was a near-death experience for that company. And overall, the cost of damage of NotPetya has been estimated by the White House at $10 billion. And we could go on and discuss other destructive attacks like WannaCry that we've seen in the last few years. The point I want to emphasize is that we now do have multiple proofs of concept that it is possible to cause disruption on a massive scale using a cyber attack on data and on control systems that regulate critical infrastructures and the supply chains on which they rely. So what am I expecting adversaries to do to exploit these vulnerabilities? And I can think of here at least 4 classes of scenario where our lack of national cyber resilience, both to cyber attacks, technical attacks, and to information operations conducted digitally, both of those that can be exploited. And the first type of scenario is to create friction when armed conflict looms. It will distract us, it will restrict our ability to mobilize and support and deploy and use our forces to their full effect in armed conflict. The second kind of scenario is rather different. We see cyber attacks and information operations used in an exemplary way to demonstrate the risks which we run if we, as we will, support our allies when they're facing a crisis. Thirdly, I think as we all know, in the grey zone below the threshold of armed conflict, we have continuing international tension and the cesspit activities, lots of crime, espionage, sabotage and subversion will go on with the intention of making our lives more difficult. And then finally, we've already seen the capability of some states to conduct international economic competition by intellectual property theft and the theft of commercially valuable information about mergers, acquisitions, negotiations, product development, and all the rest of it. So that's just a way in those four types of scenario where I am expecting our continuing vulnerability to be exploited. So, enough, Paul, on the problems arising from our dependence on the internet and the web. What now do we do about it?
David, thank you very much. Can I just pick up before we move on the vulnerability point? And I completely agree with everything you've said. If we can agree that vulnerability is increasingly a function of so much of what goes on in the digital environment, what's the quality and what's the extent and the success rate, I suppose, of mitigation? And it seems to me that when mitigation is lacking, then vulnerability, the sorts of vulnerabilities you've been discussing, vulnerability can become increasingly brittle and possibly even critical to whatever the system or the organizational structure we're talking about. And so it occurs to me then that as well as all the threats and hazards and risks that they have to confront, and everything from state-sponsored aggression and IP theft and serious crime all the way down to the individual nuisance hacker, then it seems to me that the users of cyberspace in this environment of unmitigated vulnerability have in a sense become a threat to themselves, which is, I think, part of the threat perspective. So my question really is whether you think we're doing enough to mitigate this whole spectrum of vulnerability at the moment.
To which the short answer is no, we're not doing enough. And as I indicated, I don't think yet the recognition is there, despite the proofs of concept and attacks we've seen, some of which, of course, rebound on the attacker, the NotPetya worm that was intended to destabilise Ukraine, escaped, as these things do if they're not properly designed, and this wasn't. It was a very reckless attack by Russia, and even Rosneft, the giant Russian oil company, in the end got hit with it. And that clearly was, I'm sure, not intended. One way of thinking about this, I have another acronym, IED, which we normally think of as improvised explosive device, but in this case stands for the three words intensity, extent, and duration. And those, to me, are the three dimensions that you need to work on to create mitigation. Can you reduce the intensity of that initial impact when the virus or whatever, the malware, strikes? Can you reduce its extent? Can you contain it, prevent its spread? And then finally, duration of the disruption, which is more down to the more conventional business continuity planning, investing in resilience, having backup transformers, and all the rest of it, so that although there will be disruptions, they needn't last for as long as they would if you didn't have that kind of resilience preparation.
It's extremely useful. I really like I've always liked cesspit, and now I really like IED as well. But so if we move on, the next speaker on my list is actually me. A few remarks from me on resilience, what we need to prioritise if we want to keep our societies resilient. And I should first say I think that resilience it's a much used word, but I think it's extraordinarily important in the current cybersecurity and cyber defence debate. I see it as the more passive component of cyber deterrence. During the Cold War we had punitive deterrence and deterrence by denial, and I see resilience, cyber resilience, as very much falling in the bracket of the deterrence by denial. Don't need to call it that, we don't need to try and evoke the Cold War, but it has that sort of significance for me. All that said, I think we need to, and I think you and I have had this discussion before, David, is to think of resilience as something a bit more sophisticated than perhaps we used to in the past. Resilience is sometimes described as get back ability or something, or go back ability. In other words, moving back to the position from which you've just been moved off by an attack of whatever sort. That seems to me, and I've described it elsewhere, as dumb resilience. In other words, what it means is you just moved back, you put in a lot of effort, to move yourself back to a position in which you've just been attacked. So that doesn't make much sense to me. So I've argued for what I call smart resilience, whereby you move back to somewhere slightly different, a different position, a different suite of vulnerabilities or whatever you like, in an effort to try and regain some of the initiative that might have been lost by virtue of the first attack. And I go even further than that to suggest that somehow what we need to be doing is what I call dynamic resilience, whereby we don't just seek a new position in response to an attack. We're constantly moving our defensive positions in some way, perhaps through the use of artificial intelligence, to get us to a position which is more of an agile target than perhaps it is at the moment to certain adversaries. So that's my view of resilience, what it is and how important it is. And I wish I could know of some AI-assisted way to move a defensive position, whether it's a bank or a government or whatever else, but constantly in such a way that the adversary was wrong-footed. The one thing that we know is that we know, or we should know, our own systems and our own interlinkages and our own vulnerabilities far better than the adversary does. So what I'm talking about is trying to make use of that, trying to exploit that to our advantage. On to resilience itself then, and what we should do about it, how to prioritize. Well, of course, it depends on who you are. I was talking to a client this morning, and their perspective was very different from other clients. I mean, it goes without saying. A bigger organization, a financial organization, let's say, is going to have different requirements from a hospital. But in general, I think we can come up with a couple of points. The first, I think, is to prioritize vulnerability, is to accept the point that David has been making so well so far, which is that whoever you are, wherever you are vulnerable, and you have to do something about it. And I think that, in a sense, is the first step towards wisdom in resilience. I think then it's a matter of prioritizing operational integrity. Whatever the organization, whatever level, indeed right the way down to the individual, what really matters, I think, is securing as much as you can of your operational integrity. And I'd also say that might even be more important than securing your foundations of data or your collections of data or whatever. These, it seems to me, are vital aspects of the organization, but they're not the crown jewels, so to speak. The crown jewels of any organization must be the ability to maintain some level of operational integrity. That, it seems to me, is what resilience must also be about. And I'd also say, finally, that resilience lies in a curious way in communication. Communication with adversaries, because I think that what is also under threat of digital disruption are some of the assumptions that guide our attempts to make sense of this still evolving environment. And one such assumption concerns the possibility, perhaps even the critical importance, of having conversation of some sort, on some level, with adversaries. But it seems to me that the paradox of the information age is that while the distribution of data around the world is unprecedented in its scale and in its speed of transmission, too little of that exchange could be considered conversation. So what we have is cyberspace allowing communication without conversation, insofar as it permits surprisingly high levels of anonymity, opacity, and deniability. So the paradox of communication, as I put it, communication without conversation, has a further twist. What most distinguishes the 21st century strategic environment, in my view, from its Cold War predecessor is without doubt the development of cyberspace as both a medium of communication and a platform for strategic competition and conflict. So we've come to the point where one of the essential, as they used to be called, 3 C's of deterrence, capability, credibility, and communication. One of those 3, communication, has itself become a battleground. And the means to deter conflict have for some become the means to pursue it on that battleground. And this helps explain, I think, why theories of cyber deterrence are in certain cases inclined to the deterrence of actions rather than actors. In other words, for example, don't attack certs. That concludes my point, really. Establishing some level of communication somehow, by some route, with the adversary. And I know this involves broader discussions about attribution and so on and so forth. Communication must be a vitally significant part of the resilience effort. With that, we'll move on to Dr. Chris Demchak from the United States Naval War College. I'll let you carry on and introduce what it is you're going to talk about. Over to you, Chris.
I saw the question that you asked me, and I'm going to answer that question, but I cannot help but interject on resilience. I've written 2 books on the topic, and I love it when I hear it, because when you talk to people who are more technically inclined, their definition of resilience differs from the business definition of resilience, which differs from the definition you see from people who study large-scale socio-technical systems like myself, which differs from the definition that people who study international security. And Paul, when you said the 3 C's of cyberspace, my pen lifted off the paper because, of course, I know the 3 C's of cyberspace. They are connectivity, content, and cognition. When you said capability, credibility, and communication, I went, whoa, yet another part of the elephant. Well done, you. So I think there's actually 6 C's, and I will just throw my 3 on top of yours, and we'll get a better elephant out of this. I'm obliged to say that anything I have said, will say, or should think about saying my thoughts alone, and don't reflect any position of any element of the U.S. government or my grandmother or anyone, actually, but me. I want to make 3 points today. And the question I was asked was, what can countries do in order to protect themselves in this environment? And, of course, my work always begins with how do countries protect themselves against large-scale systemic surprises that disrupt them. I echo both of your comments, Paul, yours with great intensity, that resilience cannot simply be getting back to where you were. And in fact, in the work that I did with Louise Comfort and Arjen Boyne, what we made a point of saying that it is not resilience unless you have innovated beyond what made you vulnerable to begin with. Otherwise, it was not resilience. And that makes a lot of sense, also in thinking about it as a large-scale socio-technical and economic system that has to evolve in order to survive. But my comment, 3 points I want to make today. Start with my personal, private group of folks I care about, which are the democracies. And, not only are these the folks that made the internet, and made it in such a shoddy fashion that it's now come back to bite them in such a way that they're losing 1 to 2% of their GDP annually. But these are also the countries that are coming to the very slow realization that we're a minority of states in the wider world, and that we didn't change the world into us, and that most of the time we ran the world, China, was outside of our little world, and so was the Warsaw Pact. And actually so was India, and if you want to think about it in some way. So we're now coming to the grips with the fact that we have a major adversary whose scale and strategic coherence is not something that we individual democracies can accommodate nicely, because China's intent upon the world, its ambitions are simply growing. And frankly, I don't think they're going to get any milder as Xi Jinping ages. We don't have very many examples of dictators just kind of easing off like Franco did. So I suspect he's going to get even more interested in, leaving a legacy if he won. And as a minority of states, we also have a very unique governmental system, which means we are not actually in step with the more authoritarian parts of the world. And neither are the rules we attempted to make our part of the world comply with. So over time, we have a major problem of survival, and we can't do it individually. So my second point is we will need to collectively defend and create this resilience. And I have written on this and spoken on this, but I see 3 imperatives. And the very first one, of course, is we have to recognize the scale problem we will never overcome unless we do it collectively. We are collectively roughly 1 billion people. I can speak to India a little bit later, but the consolidated democracies are roughly 1 billion people. It's a wonderfully large market. We can work with that market. So the first thing we have to do is scale up. And we have to include, by the way, each other's private sector and our private sector in this scaling up. The second thing we have to do is we have to buy time. We are losing 1 to 2% of our GDP, and this was before COVID. And COVID has made a major hit on us. And yeah, it's all right. We can jiggle the numbers so it looks like we're recovering nicely. But the reality is we are seeing it ripple through our society. The most recent headline I saw is students in my state and an adjacent state have lost 10% on the scores, all the educational scores from a year in COVID. And of course, that's nothing compared to the effects it has on other issues. So we need to buy time. And the only way to do that is to create some mechanism by which the private sector is involved in helping us defend and in this resilience. This is not a time anymore. We have to rethink the separation between economics and the wider social system. United States, we've always had the attitude, you guys go out and make as much money as you can, and we, the government and society, will take care of everything else. No, now they have to be inside the tent, and they have to recognize their survival is tied to our survival. And we can offer them things that make this easier for them. Right? The third imperative is that we have to get down and transform the underlying internet. It was so crappily put together. I'm now giving lectures on emerging technologies like artificial intelligence and their security. And what's their problem? Their problem is they're the offspring of cyberspace. And they're as vulnerable as any part of cyberspace, the data, the algorithms, the development. So we don't get down and transform the underlying technology, then we cannot solve these things. It's fundamentally insecurable. So that leads me to the third point when you, Paul, particularly know well. And I think that we have to collectively create what I call a cyber operational resilience alliance. And it is not an alliance as we've seen before. It's more like a huge multi-party joint venture. It is operational. And by that I mean that we recognize in this particular huge problem that we created for ourselves that we have to have our private sector, and our private sector has to take responsibilities, but we do too. We have to provide the funding to the labs, to the universities, to the private sector folks that will allow them to transform the technology, that will allow them to feel comfortable working within this Cyber Operational Resilience Alliance. And we have to create an institution that's federated. I am working on a book right now, a manuscript, in which I'm going to describe, I hope, how all this is going to work out. But this has to be something that we turn to relatively rapidly. Now, there are a lot of recommendations. I've seen words like, alliance I haven't seen so much, but I have seen treaty, forum, community. We have the Geneva effort put out by Microsoft. So this is being recognized, but I argue it has to be collectively agreed to and pulled together as consolidated democracies. And we're the only ones who can do it. And we're also, by the way, the only group of states across the world that have ever shown the ability that we can collectively create an organization like NATO, like EU, and make it work. And so this is what I say we have to do. We cannot do it individually, and we have to move fast.
Picking up on the Cyber Operational Resilience Alliance, it's such an appealing idea, this idea of a public-private collaboration. And it's something that you touch on and several other authors in our handbook discuss as well. And it just provokes one question in my mind, which is, as well as the distribution of funds from the public to the private sector. And this is a question that always arises when we're trying to work out how the public-private relationship should develop in the provision of security, cybersecurity at the state level. So the argument for giving the labs more money, that's fine. We all understand that. But does responsibility go with it? In other words, are we going to be at the point where we're expecting private organizations to take more, societal, national responsibility? In other words, that having been the province traditionally of governments, governments haven't only got the money, they've also got the responsibility for providing security. We're going to give a lot of that money to the private sector. Are we going to give them responsibility too?
Absolutely. It doesn't come free.
Mm-hmm.
And the irony is that there's some parts of this that they have been doing anyway. They've just only been doing it for their clients and not for the rest of us. As long ago as, and it does feel a long time ago, as 2013-14, I had some lovely conversations with representatives of our backbone providers in the United States. And we would talk about what they would do for their clients, but they wouldn't do for you, or you wouldn't do for the government. And because they said they didn't have the authority, they didn't have the responsibility, it wasn't their problem. Thank you very much. But they have the technical capability of doing it. I think they've come around. I mean, I think they are much more aware of the threat these days. But that doesn't mean that they're able to make that case to their stockholders. So that case has to come externally, it has to come from the government making that point, and from all of us making that point. But we have done this before, and it's that's part of the responsibility they would have. They're more, just to use my threes, which is actually Dan Kuhn's threes from some years ago. They're more responsible for connectivity issues. They're the backbone. Now, this is complicated by clouds and by whose clouds are out there. So then you turn to the John Mallory term, of course, the IT capital goods industry, the Googles and the Facebooks and the Microsofts and the Apples and so on. You turn to them, and these are the people creating the content, the software, the AI and so on. And their responsibility is in large part the transformation, but their responsibility is also to create the fundamental material of this new internet that doesn't have the vulnerabilities that we've all identified. And Paul, you know in particular that I've talked about these 5 offense advantages, amongst them, deception, the ability to reach at any proximity, any scale organization. So their responsibility is to work on this new, democratic, but secured internet that doesn't have these vulnerabilities already built in. There are people working in pieces. There are programs. I think the one I'm thinking of at the moment is IBM's program, where they have a language called F#, and you take your crappily coded application, whatever it is, and you give it to them and they run it through F#, and F# compiles it in the F# language, which is less vulnerable. And so you end up with the program doing what the program used to do, but it now does it in a way that makes it much harder to hack. And these are little things, but these are the things they know about, they can do. And it has a, question of how persuaded they are that this is necessary for their long-term survival, and then what the return is. The stakeholders need a reason. And that's what the Cora has to provide that.
David, I wonder if I could draw you in on this, because you've seen this, very closely from inside the system, if I can use that rather silly expression, and looking in on it from outside. In academia, governments own 95% of the problem of providing security, but they own only 5% of the equipment. The private sector owns 95% of the equipment, but 5% of the problem. But I've always been intrigued by how you somehow rebalance that relationship.
Well, I think Chris's fundamental point has to be right, because governments don't have the capability and the industry does. But we also need to think about, do we want to create a cyber-industrial complex in the way we had the military-industrial complex? Competition is a valuable thing if you have the right, a well-regulated market. So some of the problems that we can see are because of competition between these giant players. They don't want to give an inch to their potential competitors. Then when they do start to get fixes, for example, to some of the Rowhammer problems, they oversell them, and then researchers have to patiently demonstrate that actually it isn't a fix and they've got to start again. So we don't know what such an alliance would actually look like. And the interesting question is, do you approach this step by step, for example, by taking first the argument about the content passing through the networks and say you don't just provide the pipes, you actually have a responsibility for the content, and if there's a lot of malware passing through, that's because you haven't actually been operating your cloud in the way you should be. You build it up and then you move on to the next problem. Or do you sit down and try and hammer out what an alliance, what the basic ground rules would be? That's going to be difficult. It'll only be possible when the realization sort of finally dawns that their financial success and financial future actually depends on getting the internet in a better shape. For as long as they can ride along quite happily making very large excess profits, paying insufficient tax, why would they want to radically change? So we'll just have to wait for yet more proofs of their vulnerability and some big hits in their stock price. And then suddenly they'll wake up, because that certainly would alter the balance.
That could be the real mover then, as opposed to, waiting patiently for some major, almost a constitutional shift, away from civil government to something else.
My favorite example, because it's the nice and the cleanest one, but it's a bit old. In our Civil War, we used trains, right? And we put officers in charge, and it was a complete disaster. So what we did instead, we would go and we'd pick railroad men, and we would just, make them generals. You had to make them generals because the officers wouldn't listen to them otherwise. So you went brevet general, and then they told the officers what to do, and then the Union Army was able to move around. Ceding that kind of governmental preeminence to a private sector is done on a regular basis. It just depends on whether or not there's, the need is accepted. I don't see the problem. I do see the usual sort of, excessive responses going, oh, right, you're going to make a Cyber Operational Resilience Alliance. You're going to make fortress democracy somewhere. Then nobody will trade with anyone. And this is never going to be the case. And people said that about the EU too. So, right. The other thing is I call it a federated one, because one of the things that has to happen, and is ironically sort of already happening, is that we have to have a single point of contact inside each country. You federate it beyond that. And so that allows a lot of the same sort of sovereignty issues to be somewhat resolved. What we do is we collectively agree on these things. We will transform, we will fund the transformation, and we will defend collectively. And as it turns out, again, in these private conversations, defending collectively is not something the private sector rejects. They kind of like that. And looming on the horizon are the very elements that would take them out very directly. And that's Chinese funded state champions. And slowly and surely they are quite recognizing that they do not have long-term survival.
You have to have the conversation and say, this is what's in it for you.
Yes.
I mean, that's the part that's kind of missing. Why would they, at the moment, want to do this? And as you say, long-term survival, including the survival of the wealth of the creators, depends on having a more secure internet.
In 2006, there were 7 major global telecommunications companies, and only one was Chinese. That was Huawei. By 2014, 4 were Chinese, and the other 3 were, sort of stumbling mergers of the original 6.
The Chinese don't have the same nervousness about this that I seem to have. But I also think that what I'm getting from both you and David, Chris, is the sense that we have to take this bold, brave step. As you were saying, David, you don't quite know where it's going to go and how it's going to affect, but we have to take this step, because the clearest thing is what will happen if we don't. We can't stay where we are. This is not resilient. Interesting. Yeah, very interesting. We'll move to our last speaker then. Mike Steinmetz, former security advisor to the governor of Rhode Island.
First of all, I think this question that I have, do we really understand the risks to society from other malign actors, each one of us today has talked about aspects of this. What I'm hoping to do here, first of all, just as Sir David did, describe who is we. And we is not this august group of well-informed folks that have been debating this for years. It's others. And I will describe that and try and break that down in a way that's meaningful for Western thinking people. I'm going to attack this problem, dividing this into nation states, private sector, and the average citizen. Okay. Do those that are not of this cyber specialty understand the risk to themselves? So let's start with nation states. Do they really understand the risk? And I think, as Sir David and others and Chris have said already, the answer is it depends. It depends on whether you're a superpower. It depends on whether you put money into this. But like a very good friend of mine said in a panel yesterday, if this was a soccer game or football for the majority of the world, the score at half would be Western world 387 to Eastern world 293, which means it's just about how quickly you can kick the ball into the goal. There's relatively no defense. There's no structured defense. And in many cases, as I will describe, the net is wide open. All right. So basically what a lot of the nations have decided to do is because of the way the internet is structured, and Chris has done a great job of describing from DARPA on the mistakes that were made. There's not a lot of play other than offensive play at this point. So if you're a nation state, I would say my perspective is, if we're talking about the disruptors and what Reagan called the axis of evil or others, we still don't get it. Here we are, having gone through 2016 elections, having a real poke at the fabric of our democracy over here, over the same issues and the same mechanics that George Kennan identified in 1946. There is no one better on the planet for disinformation, well practiced at all levels of their government through two-rail policy, where they describe what they're going to say and what they're going to do, than the Russians. All right. Former Soviet Union, now the Russians. They're great at it. They're great at adopting new technology. They're quick adopters. So as we talk about being quick adopters and leveraging the latest, they leveraged the internet. They leveraged press post-World War II. I don't want to go into too much of a history lesson, but as nation states, the West still does not have its arms around understanding culturally Russia, let alone listening to what the president of China actually says and writes. You just need to read what he writes and listen to what he says. So I would say, in answer to that question, at the nation state level, the majority of us don't, because of a very good point Chris made earlier, and everybody has made. And I've had this written down. The future holds no space for a unilateral approach to cyber defense. The only thing is collaboration and the like of like-minded people. There's no unilateral investment that any of our nations can make without failure. And we underutilize great alliances like the NATO alliance. And I brought this up once before. Sometimes the most important thing is not that we know, is that we know where something is not in the internet. And there is no greater array like the space array that looks for sound in space, right? It looks at the edge of the universe for noise, etc., than the NATO array for something as benign as isolating and knowing where something is not. So let's take a look at that within the 20th century, social media. We've got the great meta that is now forming. It chills my heart to think about us living in more of a virtual world than we already live in, and how this is going to affect not only private sector companies, but the citizen. And the more recent attacks at the nation state level on COVID-19 research, COVID-19 information. So at the nation state level, our interests are constantly challenged. And I would say, based on outcomes and observations, or observations and outcomes. We don't get it. We don't understand the true risk. Let's move quickly on to the private sector. Sir David brought up a very good point. Until people are brought and hauled into court, there is no answer to this until it costs them something. Gartner came up with a very good prediction. They said they predict by 2034, 2035, 75% of CEOs will be held personally liable for breaches. Personally liable. No D&O insurance, no insurance is going to cover this. When that happens, you will see a reformation. There is incentive. I've always said companies, people, nation state, they do what they're incentivized to do. Right now, they're not adequately incentivized. As evidenced, just in the last couple of months, there was a 9-month breach of a very important water, critical infrastructure in Australia. Still, we're talking about a threat residing in critical infrastructure that could kill people by changing chemistry, etc., putting wastewater into clean water, etc., that people are still not taking stock of. All right? Private sectors don't understand the risk to their supply chain by what current events are globally. They don't understand this. They understand the visual of the Suez Canal being blocked by a large container ship. What they don't understand are these, where I call pinching the hose of fiber around the world. And although a bit of a stretch, the fact that the Chinese could make a worldwide tennis star, her well-being, her social media page, access to her communications, and access to her personally disappear overnight is not to be underestimated. All right? Sometimes it's not the big things in cyber. It's the ability to do something extremely subtle in cyber and tapering things off. So for the private sector, they're going to have to realize the risk to their supply chain. And they're going to have to realize that in the ever outsourcing world and going to the board and saying, well, we'll just take that risk and we'll transfer it to a third party. They are not really going to transfer this risk in the future. They will still own the risk in the future to their customer. And they don't realize that yet. Finally, let's move on to citizens. There's an ever-escalating requirement for a digital ID, for social services, to getting online, the things that we need to do. And once again, we're saddled with this architecture that just does not provide the levels of security commensurate with the level of services and security promised, either by the government or by the private sector. So we all take a chance when we bank by application. We all take a chance when we go on and log in to do our social security. There's also a fundamental misunderstanding for very well-meaning citizens. I work on the Secretary of State for Rhode Island's election board security. Open meeting. One of the citizens came up and said, you know, your voting rolls, why are you not using AWS? The CIA uses AWS, so AWS is secure. And everybody on the panel just had to bite their lip. This is a very well-meaning citizen. They'd done some research, but didn't know that platform as a service, architecture, all these kinds of things, the security was the proprietary security that the CIA brought into AWS. There's just this fundamental disconnect with what they read in the paper and what they bring as assumptions into the commons, as it was. Okay. As Paul Slovic would say, this is a gent who writes about risk, Morgan. This is a new species of trouble. Okay? A new species of trouble. And I brought this up before. You can't, in the resilience world, talk about resist and rebuilding what you built before. You must have a design that you're going to build to, whether it's the storm wall on your coastal city due to climate change that got schwacked when you had your last storm, or it's the communications infrastructure that's just not doing what it should be doing. You have to think about where you want to be, and in hockey they say skate to where the puck will be, and then go from there. You can't go to where the puck is now. You will miss the puck. The final thing I'd like to say is we talked a lot about the private sector today. And I would like to say that when it comes to the term resilience, corporate governance is broken with regard to cyber. Any corporation that feels as though that they can just keep the standard C-suite and modify people's responsibilities and give chief counsel the risk duties and give the CIO the chief security duties because we don't mess with that. There's something fundamentally flawed on this, fundamentally flawed. Corporate governance is going to have to be as resilient as these other systems are. They're going to have to flex. They're going to have to change because too many corporations, when there is breach happen, fail to answer the three fundamental questions governance is supposed to answer. Number one, what is going on? Number two, of what's going on, what is important? What are the priorities? And number three, what must I sign off on as the board or in the C-suite? And usually when you have a merger or acquisition or something like in the case of Capital One or the case of over here at Target, the wrong people are signing off. I didn't know. I didn't know it was important. When did I sign off on that? Oh, I never did. Governance is supposed to answer those questions, but the threat is so dynamic. And the rate at which we're getting information about the threat does not serve corporations well. But as Sir David said, this is not going to change until people end up in court and the actuary for this and insurance changes because of court outcomes and people begin to get fined. That's what I've got. Thank you.
Mike, thank you very much indeed. One question comes to mind, then when we'll go to Chris and then David. And it's this. You talk about the need to incentivize CEOs personally to take responsibility and so on. And this has been something that's been on my mind, would you believe, for a number of years, since running a project in this area at Chatham House. And we were doing surveys of C-suite interest in, competence in cyber. And the answer we got was almost a blank silence. But I think things are shifting. No doubt. They're probably going too slowly. But my question is this. If we want to encourage the private sector to take more responsibility, to going back to that earlier discussion, for national, societal security and whatever, is the best way to go about this to incentivize them in this rather coercive way with threats of fines and prison and so on? Is there no better way of doing it?
I hate to come back into the lawyerly office, but I think the answer comes down to the evolving definition in today's world for the CEO of what due care and due diligence mean. All right. Obviously, 10 years ago, due care and due diligence meant different things to the C-suite and the board than they do today. Once again, this gent Paul Slovic writes on this a topic called risk as a feeling. And I know that I have made this mistake myself. You can stare at corporate risk for so many quarters over and over and over again. It's almost hypnotizing. It doesn't change. The calculus doesn't change substantially for the board. The messaging doesn't change until, bam, something happens and then somebody calls it a black swan. But somebody else comes in and says, no, this is something you should have seen. But the repetitive nature of some of this with regard to the impact, reputational risk, the likelihood not really moving very much because of the way the board and CEOs see risk as big handfuls. They don't see it in small bites, most of them. They see this in big handfuls. That's going to need to change. So how we perceive risk, how that risk is communicated, the governance by which the risk is collected, communicated, the board directs the audit committee to take action on their behalf, all must be resilient in a way that they're measuring something that gives them a productive outcome. Does that make sense?
Very much so. Yeah. Thank you very much. Yeah. Chris, I'll come to you now, and then perhaps after you we'll go to Sir David. And David, if you'd be happy to give any remarks you have and to wind up the conversation, that would be super. Chris, over to you.
What Mike has pointed out is actually worse than we know, because there are people that have calculated the risk And unfortunately, it's those lovely academics who have done it, and they're economists, and they've calculated such things as, yes, well, whatever your CISO comes in and says you should spend, you really only need to spend about 30% of that, because we've calculated that that's all the costs we can determine if you have a nasty breach. And so, naturally the board's response is to cut to a third whatever they're asked and say, well, we've done it. There's our due diligence. I have a terrible story for you, Mike, as well. A colleague of ours, you know him, I'm not going to say who he is now, left professorial computer science, worked for government for a while, went out and was running a very successful cybersecurity program with all the good things we would imagine. He gets bought out, fine, and then the CEO level, the C-suite, comes down to him and says, "Why are you spending so much money? Because we have seen these figures." And we only need to worry about 30% of the risk. And the fight is now going on. I agree completely that one of the things about ACORA, the Cyber Operation Resilience Alliance, is the narrative, and the narrative helps a few other things. And one of them, I think, will be the change of what is due diligence. Because when you change the narrative, say, you, corporation, you have a role in the survival of the system around you. Remember, that has always been the big deal, right? We separated economics from politics, and that's how our democracy, at least in American context, that's how we've always survived. It's never been true, but we tell ourselves that. No, you have a role in it. And one of the examples I wrote down as you were talking was, whatever happened to the CEO of SolarWinds? I can tell you, nothing. We do know that when he started SolarWinds, he knew absolutely nothing about technology. And throughout the organization, it was, what will they buy? What will they buy as we sell it to them? And then we'll just keep telling them we did it. And it was a disaster waiting to happen. And, the Russians went, well, thank you very much. Nothing happened to him. Until something happens to someone who can set up a firm like that, then we are in difficulty. And I reiterate, we need a narrative that says this is our long-term survival. And by the way, it's yours too. Do not imagine that the Chinese will let you occupy the position you occupy now in the world going forward. They will not. And we need to work on that. But that's at least what I was thinking of. One good note, when I go and talk with them, the senior folks are like, well, whatever the numbers are, but there's this lower level right below them. And they seem to have a much better understanding. And they nod along and listen. So we don't have time to wait for the younger folks to take over, but we know they're out there.
That's really interesting. So in a way, the drivers for this change in due diligence are going to be both regulatory, if you like, from government, this coercive incentivization I referred to, but also via insurance risk and so on. And it is true to say, isn't it, that more and more insurance and reinsurance firms are underwriting cyber risk, it's changing very slowly, but it is changing. Yeah.
It is getting so expensive in the United States because of ransomware. We are now seeing a world in which if we require insurance, you could break a company to have to buy it. Therefore, the company's going to have some other means. They'll start looking for some other way to prove that they are secure. And that at least is one of those indirect incentives that will work in our favor. But I hope we have the time for that.
Chris, thank you very much indeed. So, David, we'll come to you for the answer to everything.
Great conversation. I've been making notes as you were speaking, so I've got a lot on my notepad. But we've got two problems, haven't we? We've got the long term, which means obviously starting now, because it's going to take time to create the future conditions, the alliance. But we've also got to survive the next few years when we may be severely tested. And that does mean persuading a lot of people to improve their resilience. And it also, if I might add to your lexicon, Paul, means improving psychological resilience, so that people don't freeze when bad things happen. They take it in their stride. It's the old fortitude word. But looking to Chris's alliance, And there's one task that they could do, which is to revive and update some of the thinking which was going on 5 or 10 years ago between some of the big giants about building an internet within the internet, where you had to prove root identity in order to access it. It would be subscription. But once it was up and running, the incentive on businesses and on parents worried about children's safety and all the rest of it would be, let's use the secure internet with different protocols. Then, of course, the libertarian wing could be satisfied by saying, well, the Wild West is still there if you want to use it, but it's at your own risk. Sensible people don't use it, a bit like the deep web. But coming back to Mike's point, I mean, there are two motivators here. One is fear of loss, and the other is greed for success, which isn't just money. It's sometimes relative success, relative to peers that they measure themselves by. And both of those motivators, these are levers that have to be used. It's not just about punitive measures, but it's also about offering the incentives. Because deep down there is this, I call it greed, but it's human passion to want to succeed and to build things and do things.
Great. David, thank you very much indeed. And I just want to finish by thanking all three of our speakers, Professor Sir David Omand, Professor Chris Demchak and Michael Steinmetz, for a really excellent conversation, I think. I've certainly enjoyed and learned a lot from it. All four of us on this podcast today are authors of the Oxford Handbook of Cybersecurity, full of information and wisdom and all sorts of insights, and I would heartily recommend it. Given the circumstances in pandemics and whatnot, this is probably going to be the launch event for the Oxford Handbook of Cybersecurity. So my particular thanks to Cityforum for giving us this space today and for allowing such an excellent discussion